Okay, let's dive right into this. We are looking at one of history's absolute greatest biological paradoxes, and it's one that fundamentally shaped the entire modern world. Picture this. Deep inside the Lascaux caves in southern France, roughly 17,000 years ago, early humans painted two animals side by side, and they painted them with this immense precision and intimacy, a real sense of reverence that you only get from generations of sustained observation. One was the massive aurochs, the terrifying wild ancestor of the cow. The other was the red deer. Now, humans depended on both. We hunted both, and we utilized both for survival. Yet over the millennia that followed, only one of these species would be pulled into the most transformative biological partnership in the history of life on Earth.
So, it brings us to this incredibly fascinating question. Both of these animals shared the world with us for hundreds of thousands of years, right? But by about 8,000 years ago, we had completely transformed one of them into literally the most economically important animal in human history. I mean, reshaping diets, economies, entire civilizations. The other animal? Well, despite our immense ancestral knowledge of their seasonal movements and behaviors, they remained fiercely, stubbornly wild. So why exactly did we manage to successfully domesticate the massive lethal aurochs, but completely fail to tame the much smaller, seemingly much more approachable deer?
Just think about the sheer physical difference here for a second. The wild aurochs was an absolute unit. It stood nearly 2 meters tall at the shoulder. That is about the height of a professional basketball player, and weighed over 1,000 kilograms. It was a highly aggressive, deeply dangerous animal. Actually, Julius Caesar even noted they could easily kill a grown man. On the other hand, you have the deer. Most species rarely top 300 kilograms. They're vastly smaller, they're lighter, and their primary weapons, their antlers, literally fall off and regrow every single year. Just logically, you'd think the deer would be the vastly easier candidate for early humans armed with stone tools to manage.
Yet, genetic evidence reveals this absolutely astonishing fact. If we look at molecular biology studies tracing mitochondrial DNA, we find that all modern taurine cattle, literally every dairy cow in Europe, every single steer in the outback, descended from a tiny, manageable founding population of just about 80 female aurochs. 80! This happened roughly 10,500 years ago in what is now southeastern Turkey. That is a group small enough to fit inside a single modern dairy barn. It really shows us that domestication wasn't this casual, widespread, continent-wide process. It was an incredibly specific, hyper-focused bottleneck.
So how did early herders actually pull this off? Well, they essentially used a brilliant behavioral hack. They cleverly exploited the aurochs' built-in herd hierarchy. See, aurochs were herd animals living on open grasslands, and to survive wolf packs, they moved as this unified group led by a dominant female leader. Early humans realized something crucial. You don't need to control a whole herd of 1,000-kilogram beasts. Step 1. Just identify that dominant female. Step 2. Influence her to simply tolerate human proximity. And Step 3. The rest of the herd just instinctively follows her lead. This gave herders immense leverage over dozens of animals just by earning the tolerance of one. And over generations, they selectively bred for the calmest individuals, eventually morphing the terrifying aurochs into the placid cow we know today.
Part 1. The biology of panic and why fences are fatal. Now, when we look at the biology of the deer, we hit a fundamental roadblock that literally no amount of human patience could ever solve. Deer don't just fight domestication. They biologically cannot survive the process of being confined. They suffer from a terrifying physiological phenomenon called capture myopathy. Basically, when a deer is cornered or put behind a fence, its sympathetic nervous system experiences a full, catastrophic neurological emergency. The stress is so unbelievably intense that the animal's own muscles contract with sustained force until the fibers actually disintegrate from the inside out. This floods their bloodstream with proteins that completely overwhelm the kidneys and the heart. You could capture a deer with extraordinary gentleness, completely uninjured, and it could still drop dead days later from cascading organ failure triggered entirely by its own terror. The very mechanism that keeps it alive in the wild literally becomes fatal in a cage. And this intense reaction all comes down to their escape machinery. Deer are what behavioral ecologists call obligate fleers. When danger appears, they don't sit there and assess it, they don't form a defensive circle, and they definitely do not stand their ground. They run. And they do it with mind-blowing explosive power. A white-tailed deer can accelerate from a total standstill to 48 kilometers per hour in under 3 seconds flat. Pair that explosive acceleration with a sensory system honed by 20 million years of relentless predator selection. A deer has eyes on the sides of its head, giving it a massive 310-degree visual field without even turning its neck. Its ears rotate independently to perfectly triangulate sounds, its olfactory system up to 1,000 times stronger than ours. And physically, they can effortlessly clear a 2.7-meter fence from a standing jump because their entire neurology is perfectly calibrated to detect threats at extreme ranges. To a deer's nervous system, a fenced paddock isn't just a mild inconvenience like it is to a cow. It instantly registers as a predator's kill box.
Part 2. No leaders to follow and the chaos of the herd.
So beyond that fatal panic response, there is something deeper and totally structural that prevented humans from taming deer. Remember that elegant biological hack we just talked about with the aurochs? Find the leader, influence the leader, the herd follows? Well, deer completely break that system. They form loose, temporary aggregations. What looks to us like a cohesive herd grazing in a meadow is actually just a situational cluster of sovereign individual agents. There's no fixed dominance hierarchy that carries over from week to week. There are no permanent leaders. Capturing one deer gives you zero leverage over the rest. You don't gain a herd. You just gain one panicking animal, while 40 others instantly dissolve into the tree line in 40 completely different directions.
And then, of course, you have the danger factor. Look, both male cattle and male deer can be incredibly dangerous, but the actual mechanics of their aggression are totally different. A cattle bull's aggression is relatively constant year-round, and because it's constant, humans could gradually reduce it over centuries through selective breeding. But a deer buck's extreme aggression is strictly seasonal. During the autumn rut, a buck's testosterone spikes up to 7 times its normal baseline. He transforms into this incredibly violent animal, wielding solid bone antlers capable of puncturing organs. This aggression is deeply biologically wired directly into his reproductive cycle. You simply cannot breed out the danger without dismantling the hormonal system that makes him fertile in the first place. Tameness and fertility are wired through the exact same circuit.
Now, we humans are pretty stubborn, right? And we have absolutely tried to force the issue across centuries. By the 14th century, aristocratic England had already set up 3,200 enclosed deer parks. Fast forward to the 1970s, New Zealand launched this massive commercial deer farming industry that eventually peaked at 4,500 farms. But here's the crucial distinction. Farming is not domestication. In all these instances, humans just engineered better physical containment. Farmed deer today still retain their exact wild stress responses, their flight distances, and their seasonal behaviors. They have to be managed entirely at a distance, usually through hydraulic chutes. They merely tolerate these high-fenced enclosures as prisons, without ever fundamentally altering their wild neurology the way cattle did.
Part 3. The reindeer exception, the rule breaker of the Arctic.
But, as with any biological rule, there is a fascinating exception that proves exactly why all the others failed. Reindeer, or caribou, are that sole exception. Indigenous peoples of the Arctic, like the Sami, successfully semi-domesticated them for thousands of years. Why? Well, because behaviorally, reindeer act way more like cattle than they do their other deer relatives. They are genuinely gregarious. They form massive herds with real internal structure, where dominant females lead predictable migratory paths. Plus, because their primary predators are wolves out on the open tundra, reindeer evolved to bunch together as a cohesive mass, rather than scatter individually into the woods. If the group is calm, the individual stays calm. Their social bonds completely override that individual panic that makes red or white-tailed deer so impossible to manage.
Part 4. The Anna Karenina Principle and the Biological Checklist.
This whole puzzle brings us to a brilliant biological framework for domestication that was famously outlined by evolutionary biologist Jared Diamond in his book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. He called it the Anna Karenina Principle, based on Tolstoy's famous line that all happy families are alike, but every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Basically, successfully domesticated animals have to pass every single criterion on a strict biological checklist simultaneously. Cattle pass with flying colors, but deer, they fail on at least 4 major fronts: their unmanageable flight distance, their lack of an exploitable hierarchy, their lethal panic response, and their seasonal aggression. Failing just one trait prevents domestication. Deer fail 4 of them.
Now, you might be wondering, why not just selectively breed them for tameness? Like Soviet scientist Dmitry Belyaev did with those wild silver foxes. Belyaev famously proved you can create a tame fox in just 10 generations. But here's the catch. His foxes, while wild, had natural baseline behavioral variation. Some were just slightly less afraid than others, which gave artificial selection something to grab onto. Most deer species just lack this entirely. Their baseline stress reactivity has been set so uniformly high by 20 million years of relentless predator selection that there's barely any gap to exploit. You simply cannot selectively breed tameness into an animal that is uniformly 100% hardwired to panic.
And here is where we see the massive historical impact of this. This biological dead end literally altered the trajectory of human civilization. Over in Eurasia, they had the aurochs to turn into cattle, which led to settled agriculture, massive food surpluses, and vast empires. But crucially, living closely with those domesticated animals over millennia gave Eurasian populations cross-species zoonotic immunity. The Americas, on the other hand, were full of deer, but as we've seen, they couldn't be domesticated. The profoundly tragic result was that indigenous populations in the Americas were deprived of these zoonotic immunities. When European contact finally occurred, the resulting diseases caused an estimated 90% population collapse, a staggering loss of around 50 million people. The sheer biological impossibility of domesticating the deer actually altered the balance of global power for 500 years.
The historical irony here is just profound when you step back and look at it. The aurochs, bent to human will, became the most useful animal in history and as a result was completely erased in the wild. The last lone wild aurochs died in a Polish forest in 1627. Meanwhile, we have animals like Père David's deer, which went functionally extinct in the wild and only survived because it was kept captive as an exotic curiosity by Chinese emperors and later British aristocrats, remaining totally wild inside its walls. And today, the stubborn, panicky, untamable wild deer populations have absolutely exploded worldwide, with over 30 million white-tailed deer roaming North America alone, browsing peacefully in suburban gardens. The animal that refused to be changed is thriving everywhere.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, we really have to look at these two paths and ask ourselves a pretty deep question. Is domestication truly a biological partnership that elevates an animal, or is it an absolute absorption that ultimately costs a species its wild soul? The aurochs became our greatest asset, but it no longer exists. The deer refused us at every biological level, and they are everywhere. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.